From hospital to home, the Cardio Care Continuum.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Pinch moderating for Christina. So to get us started, market opportunities in cardiac care transitioning from the hospital to home are expanding. And this is driven by aging populations, high readmission rates for heart failure, and a shift towards value-based care with an emphasis on incentivizing reduced 30-day readmission rates. Innovation is, of course, happening across the spectrum of care, including advancements in remote monitoring, transitional services, care coordination, telehealth, and computational modeling. During this panel discussion, we hope to address the interplay between clinical efficacy, technical feasibility, and market viability as it relates to the transition of care from the hospital to home, including ongoing patient care and monitoring. So first, I'd like to start by having the panelists introduce themselves, including your title, organization, and geographic location. And then please answer the question, what should this audience be keeping their eye on in the next 12 to 24 months as it pertains to cardiac care and transitions from the hospital to home?
Start here. All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks again for being here, the last panel before drinks and dinner, so appreciate it. My name is Maulik Majmudar. I'm a cardiologist, one of the co-founders and chief medical officer of a company called Biofourmis. Biofourmis is really focused on shifting care from brick and mortar hospitals and outpatient clinics to the home environment across the full spectrum of patient acuities. So we have an acute care at home program called Hospital at Home program that we sell to health systems, all the way down to chronic care management, chronic disease management for things like heart failure, hypertension, or diabetes. As we think about the next 12 to 24 months, one of the biggest sort of advancements in the field has been the CMS's extension of the 5-year waiver for acute care at home, passed in late January, early February of this year. So we do expect uptick in number of health systems participating in these programs to transition care from emergency rooms and hospitals to the home environment, and hopefully drive much larger adoption of these novel care models that to date has still been really subscale.
And I'm David Lampert. I'm the founder and chief medical officer of AliveCor, and I've been in cardiovascular engineering and product development for about almost 40 years, actually 40 years. And along with my friend to the right here, I agree that hospital at home will be expanded. We have not really used hospital at home, that is acute care, for some of the larger cardiovascular issues. Heart failure, yes, but acute coronary syndrome. We don't send people home immediately after a stent, but I think that's coming, and I think we're going to see people try. And it's all about one thing, people, money. Because there's no more expensive venue than a hospital. And so CMS, I've heard Dr. Oz say it, is going to do a lot of experimentation as they try to decrease the per patient spend.
Excellent. My name's Homer Quintana. I'm the director of the Center for Rapid Device Translation at Houston Methodist. And as an academic hospital system, my job is really to facilitate the engagement between novel technology and clinical application. You have to have a space where you can pilot, where you can adopt, and where you can scale. And the thing that excites me about seeing the technologies that are coming in the cardiovascular and in the heart space in general is the amount of technologies that are making it into the hands of the patients in terms of a wellness and in terms of just general data collection. We sit on a massive data lake at Houston Methodist. We've been capturing data for quite some time since the pandemic, and the interpretation of this data and some things that are happening in the market with regulators and with payers are really exciting to me because, again, it's all about access. It's all about getting the technologies to the patients, transitioning from that continuum in the healthcare system or the hospital to the patient bedside. So we have that capability. I think you're going to see an acceleration and an abundance to validate those technologies.
Thanks, Homer. Ken Nelson, investor, board member, been involved with a handful of different cardiac and EP companies. More recently commercialized a couple startups in the cardiac remote patient monitoring space. And really excited for this panel and appreciate Josh, Dr. Lampert stepping in and being moderator. Christina, who's the new CEO of Heart Rhythm Society, had some travel issues and had to leave early. But this group was really handpicked, and Josh was handpicked as a stand-in because of their love for innovation in the cardiac space and because of what they're doing. So you've got Homer, who's really driving innovation in the Med Center in Houston. You've got Dr. Lampert, who is the director of machine learning at Mount Sinai in New York City, but also very involved with lots of evolving cardiac innovation, somebody I've partnered with a number of different companies and excited to get his perspective. You got Dr. Majmudar, who, apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name, Maulik, but he's a very humble guy. He was former CMO of Amazon as well. And then less humble person, Dr. Dave Albert, who's really an early innovator in the space and done so much for us to kind of follow in his pathway from the remote cardiac space. For me,
I'm really humble, really.
But things that I'm most excited about, you're starting to see the smartphone evolve into a physician in your pocket. So you start to think about smartphone as almost a physician or hospital in your pocket. That's really interesting. Technologies like Noah Labs and Happy Tech, where all you need is the smartphone and either the microphone or the camera and no additional hardware. That's really interesting. You're seeing things evolve like HeartBeam's card, which has a synthesized 12 lead that can do both arrhythmia detection and heart attack detection. And now there's even wearables that can treat arrhythmias. So you've got Stim Cardio, which is a watch doing neuromodulation stimulation to treat AFib and the precursors to AFib. So thinking about a non-invasive wearable that can treat arrhythmias, I just think is really, really exciting. And so I'd love to start diving into some of these cool discussions around this topic.
Awesome. So, Homer, maybe we'll start with you. We often see a gap between technology's clinical potential and its adoption into official medical guidelines, like those from the Heart Rhythm Society or the AHA or ACC. What high-quality clinical evidence is most critical, in your opinion, for innovations to become the standard of care, and how is your approach helping to bridge this gap?
That's a great question. It's a conversation that I have quite often with companies because the first gate that they're trying to cross in terms of that milestone-driven approach is a regulatory gate. The FDA gives you access, and that's fantastic. It means that you are safe. It means there's some efficacy there. It means that you are, if you're a 510K predicate, you're equal to, if not greater than, something that's already out there, a predicate. But at the end of the day, hospital systems, governing bodies want to see evidence that says the quality of whatever it is that I'm deploying is something that I would recommend in standard practice. And in that scenario, you have to build around clinical trials. You have to generate evidence. It's a blessing and a curse to have a 510K predicate regulatory pathway. Yes, you're going to get the clearance that you need because something exists, but theoretically or actually in practice, you're not going to have the clinical data to be attractive to healthcare providers in designating that technology. So when we're talking about level of evidence or gold standards, you're really going up against things that are in practice, head-to-head across randomized controlled clinical trials. You're looking at equivalence across multi-diversity populations. And I benefit from living in Houston. As many of you know that have met me and are in Houston, Houston's the most diverse city in the United States right now. And in fact, that city is what the rest of the United States is supposed to look like in 25 years. So diversity is an easy thing to be able to include in clinical trials in places like the Texas Medical Center. But you have to have that inclusion, and you have to generate evidence that goes beyond changes in biomarkers. I need primary endpoints that are looking at mortality, morbidity. I need endpoints that are talking about hospitalization and getting these patients home. And so it is a very interesting position to be in, and I've heard it from several companies that I've met with today about, I'm looking at regulatory clearance, but I need to get to the next phase because it's adoption. And adoption only happens if you have the currency of the realm, and that currency is hard evidence. And then some things around training and education and having a proper curriculum that are going to dictate just how well that is adopted. But you have to have the language to speak in terms of evidence.
That's some really great points. Actually, to springboard off of that comment, you mentioned the 510K pathway. One very discrete example that I think many of us appreciated was Apple's hypertension algorithm that was approved through the 510K pathway with a predicate device being a convolutional neural network on a 12-lead ECG, whereas their algorithm, right, for a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, rather than the PPG-based hypertension algorithm. Now, clearly, we need to balance innovation with responsible deployment, and so I'm curious. This is for the whole panel. What is your thought on the balance of the 510K pathway to help drive innovation and allow deployment of new tools that have statistical underpinnings that are relevant and safe, but may be different from other softwares that are being used as medical devices?
First of all, I don't think anybody else could do that than Apple. Tim Apple has a very special relationship with the President of the United States. So how you take a 12-lead ECG for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and have it be the predicate for a PPG-based hypertension risk, I don't know anybody who understands that. So, we could talk about zebras and unicorns, but talking about the regular things, I think all an FDA 510K is opening the door. That doesn't mean you're going to be a success. And there's so many startups, I've talked to them all the time, who think, well, then I'm done. No, you're not. That's the beginning. That's not the end. And so I think we're all going to find out, as he said, you've got to have hard evidence of improved outcomes. Now, improved outcomes can be patients do as well, but we do it cheaper. Or it can be, well, maybe it is a little bit more expensive, but the patient outcomes are better. So that's the balance that a health system or a physician looks to decide whether they're going to use something new or not. And I think that's after the 510K. And so, that's the beginning. And when you go to home, we're going to have some new notions. If you take care of an acute patient at home, do you get the same outcome that you get if they're in the hospital? We're going to have to find out. The evidence looks like, yes, you do. And oh, by the way, the patient likes it better. They eat their own food. They're in their own bed. And that's never been a metric before.
There's a question there as well, but just to add to what Dave just said, I think the regulatory policies are evolving pretty rapidly in this administration's environment as well. So traditionally, as Ken knows very well, traditionally you would say, well, what has to go through the 510K pathway? It was always based on intended use of the tool you're building. And if it's a medical device, a diagnostic, a therapeutic, you had a very standard approach, which is you had to prove safety and efficacy. I think under the new administration, there's models like Tempo, which have carved out the ability to deploy novel tools, innovative technologies without FDA clearance under the umbrella of a value-based care model. So I think some of the things are shifting. And for care models like hospital at home, they're not a medical device per se. You can now demonstrate outcomes that have either financial efficacy and or clinical efficacy as a care model as opposed to a medical device. I think there's multiple different ways in this environment you can demonstrate the value, but to Homer's point, you still have to demonstrate value.
Great. Yeah, we have a question.
So I have a question for Homer. So I come out of the pharma industry originally, and I know all about outcome trials. They're huge and very expensive. For most medical devices, absolutely not affordable. What kind of model could a hospital have with a device company to do RWE-based, working with you? Because a lot of our pivotal trials are meeting certain kinds of accuracy standards. It has absolutely nothing to do with outcomes. So we need to have some way to work with hospitals who are willing to work with us and collaborate on an RWE structure. What can be done there so that we're not paying $20,000 per patient for our RWE? Where is the model for the sharing on that?
That's a great question, and that keeps me up at night with companies from all over the world that visit the Texas Medical Center in hopes that they can garner that type of support. And it's a real thing that happens, right? And the answer is you have to have a collaborative team that's going to build the plane as it's flying. I hate to think of it as messy, but it is a bit messy. At the end of the day, everything that we're building towards within Houston Methodist in particular is for patient care, but we understand the value proposition that needs to be built along the way. So when we're putting together teams, there are teams that are based around the clinical component, there are teams that are based around quality and outcomes, and then there are teams that are looking at the billing and a few other things that are going to be pertinent for you to be able to build a case. All of these studies you can conduct depending on the class of the technology, either as a pilot, which is going to turn into a marketing study. Let's face it. The reason that I'm conducting a clinical trial after a 510K clearance is so that I can market that technology to similar institutions, and I can use that as promotion that my technology is going to help me do X, Y, Z in terms of a value proposition. The other types of trials that I like to see are when you're going head to head versus whatever it is that's top of the line. Now those may cost a little bit more, but at that point you are proving without a shadow of a doubt superiority over that standard of care, and you have now positioned yourself to become that gold standard of care. So there's different ways to kind of frame it, but it's just dependent on the appetite and obviously on the financial component of what's at stake. We're very flexible. You can talk to some of the companies that I'm working with that are sitting at this table and a few other places. They'll tell you how we function, but at the end of the day, you have to look at what are we doing for our patients, and what are we doing for our healthcare system? One of the things that I always talk about is that healthcare as a financial model is contracting. The payments that you're receiving today will not be greater in the future, and if you're lucky, they'll stay the same in terms of what you're making as a hospital system. You have to figure out a way to be efficient, and I think the technologies that we're talking about, hospital at home, some of the digital health applications that are being developed are going to be so beneficial to changing the paradigm of what healthcare looks like. It's an exciting time, to be honest with you, and I'm very fortunate to be at the forefront of engaging with those types of discussions. They're not easy. They are not easy discussions because you're looking at changing an entire paradigm or a methodology that's been developed. But at the end of the day, there's an opportunity there to make tremendous change.
That's great. So one of the, I think, overarching concepts here is on some of the limitations to actually move things forward. And so to kind of go into that a little bit further, Ken, if I could ask you, in your opinion, what are the biggest barriers to entry in bringing new innovations into the cardiac hospital-to-home market segment?
Yeah, I think for one, commercializing a product can be expensive. And so trying to find the right commercial partner, number one. Number two, at least what I've found personally from the companies I've been involved with and commercialized, is that to really move faster, you need a direct sales force in many cases, especially if it's a physician preference item. And so you've got to get the right investors who will partner with you or strategics who will fund that commercialization. The other thing is finding physicians who you can have on your either strategic advisory board or medical advisory board who can help guide you as to, are you developing the right sort of product? Does it fit into the physician's workflow? Is it something that's already reimbursable, or do you have to go down and get a new code, which can create a whole other timeline for you and another set of costs and really complicate things?
So to follow up on that, you raise a really great point. So C-suite executives will seek to de-risk implementation of any new system. How do you feel CMS reimbursement, such as add-on CPT codes and other incentives, can facilitate sustainable adoption? And then maybe, Ken, just to start with you,
Sure.
and we can go down the panel.
Yeah, I think when you look at, let's take, for example, the remote patient monitoring codes, the RPM codes. I feel like there's only one set of codes for, you could have 10 different sensors that are monitoring for sleep apnea diagnostics and heart failure diagnostics, yet you're not getting reimbursed appropriately. So I think they really need to change that quickly so that some of these evolving companies and emerging companies can actually get the reimbursement to the physicians to drive adoption. If they don't figure that out, it just really stumps adoption of these newer technologies. But would love to hear from the rest of the group on that topic.
I mean, one of the things that's been interesting, if you look at the arc of the CMS policies, starting way back when with meaningful use with EMR adoption, so always this influx of capital to drive adoption early on. So EMRs, it was meaningful use, then RPM codes was for remote patient monitoring, Now they have acute care at home waiver for hospital at home, so they have these models. But I do think the world's shifting where there's a lot more focus on the total cost of care. And if you look at Chris Klomp and Oz, they've been very clear that whatever they do in CMS, they want it to be deflationary. So they want to remove costs from the system, not add costs to the system. So I do think what we're seeing with the access model and other models like that, like the ambulatory specialty care models, is they're going to try to bucket this into a value-based care model, so they don't have to worry about CPT codes. And if I were to forecast the future, in probably the next few years, you're going to see them take away some of these CPT fee-for-service revenue codes and say, how can we tie that into an outcomes-based model where the providers are free to use whatever technology they think is appropriate to drive the outcomes, and they can pay for that in that bundled payment, as opposed to paying fee-for-service codes. I think that's just the way things are shifting. So as new technologies come about, they'll have to think about how do they tie into overall outcomes and the relative cost of new technology as opposed to having a fee-for-service code.
Great. And one of the, sorry, Dave, do you want to add?
Well, I'm just going to follow up the access program. For instance, you'll get some money from Medicare if you're accepted for taking care of a hypertensive patient. But you don't get the rest of it unless you decrease their systolic blood pressure by 10 millimeters of mercury, a very hard threshold in order to get money. That's a new thing. That's really paying for an outcome. And, your AFib ablation with your new PFA system, well, you better be AFib free at 9 months, or else, oh, by the way, we're only going to use 70% of the money. These are the kinds of things I think are coming. And we cannot spend unlimited money. And in the United States, we've been doing it. The rest of the world looks at us and shakes their head anyway.
I can see the challenge that you're raising. One of the caveats there, of course, is oftentimes, especially with these new technologies as they come about, it requires infrastructure to be able to handle those outputs, whether you're deploying models in your health system or whether you're just identifying disease in your EHR to surface those new patients. Somebody supervising an agentic system is going to be responsible for acting on those. And so the reimbursement or payment is going to have to cover those resources. Do any of you have concerns over hospitals not being incentivized to maybe use better tools because they're concerned about the upfront cost of having to actually implement them?
When they tell you it's not about the money, it's all about the money. Yes.
I think it's a great question. I think strategically, if you're a health system in a home or you work with one has to really think about the ultimate ROI of the ultimate outcome they desire. Because there is going to be upfront investment to then realize the outcome long term. And in the example you gave, it's possible the hospital has to invest in either resources, training, or tools and technologies to then build the capabilities to then deploy the new technology. So I do think that's going to happen more frequently. I think one thing CMS has said very clearly is I don't think they're going to pay for AI agent codes, right? They've been very clear on that. So you can deploy AI agents or AI tools as part of a solution, but I don't think they're intent to create code specifically for these AI tools.
So transitioning a little bit away from the data collection and operationalizing them on the hospital end, David, maybe if I can ask you, so for a successful hospital-to-home program, technology must not just create an unnecessary burden on the actual end user, which is often the patient. So how do you balance data collection with a simplified user-centric design for patients often who may potentially have low technical and healthcare literacy?
Well, there comes good user design. I've sold 6 million personal ECG devices. The majority of our devices at any given month, year, 65% are people over the age of 63. We have lots of people in their 70s, in their 80s, who can use a simple device. So that's just good design, and those are good design ethics. And so I think we're going to have, changing out an IV bag at home. You're going to have to figure that out. It cannot be as complex as what you do in a hospital with a, BSNRN. And I think, but you want to have the same outcomes, at least the same outcomes. So I think it's going to be a challenge to those manufacturers and those providers, the service providers, to make it patient home user-friendly.
Awesome. And then, so maybe if I can turn to Maulik for a moment. As we migrate to more personalized care, how can innovations in this space tailor medical and rehabilitation to specific patient needs, particularly for older patients who may feel they are fending for themselves after they're discharged from the hospital?
Yeah, I mean, I think the post-acute period of post-hospitalization is a really critical window of time. As we think about opportunities, I think that's sort of three things one thinks about, right? First and foremost is how does the patient recover post-hospitalization back to their functional quality of life. I think for the most part, for clinicians in the audience here, it's a black box to us. Once a person leaves the hospital, you sort of don't see them, and some other provider sees them like 3, 6, 9 months later. So I do think there's this opportunity to think about, is there sort of continual monitoring of the individual in the first 30, 60, 90 days to ensure they recover fully back to their baseline, and or at least at the very least don't bounce back to the hospital with the readmissions. But I think another lens we've applied to that window is like, well, what if you could discharge them earlier? If you had a set of tools or technologies, could you reduce length of stay? And can you, quote unquote, complete the course of care in the home? So a classic example is somebody with heart failure or AFib with RVR, right? You can do the IV Lasix or sub-Q Lasix now in the home. And if you had the ability to draw the blood, have a nurse visit the home once, and have technologies to do remote monitoring, you can imagine a world where your length of stay is not 4 or 5 days, it's 2 days, and the rest of it's in the home. So we call this like transitional care at home. To me, there's lots of clinical conditions I can think of cardiovascular and beyond cardiology where it could substantially reduce length of stay, which translates to lower cost of care. And having technologies like the ones to just do more physiological monitoring, but also beyond that, technologies to do wound care, nursing, phlebotomy in the home in an easy, accessible way can really sort of reduce the overall cost of care to the system. And patients love it because they can be home sooner and they can be in their own beds.
So before I ask a maybe challenging question, first I want to check out at the audience if anyone has any questions or follow-ups that they want to start off with before we continue.
Mayank, do you have a question?
Go ahead.
Maulik, mostly for you. You started mentioning some of these CMS models like Access, and I think, so I'm in the digital MSK space.
Sure.
So when you use our technology like, for example, like Corey Health and these digital providers, a lot of them haven't seen that these reimbursement models, that there's enough money in them, for them to even go after them. And so these organizations that have designed their entire platforms to support programs like that and reduce cost of care by, say, 30, 40%, feel as though there's not enough money in these reimbursement structures to actually be worth going into. So I'm curious, maybe it's just the reimbursement structures, but what are the flaws that you see in some of these reimbursement models that you'd like to see change?
Great question. Topic of heavy discussions here and everywhere else. And I think you got two people on the stage, both of whom pledged for the Access program. We did not participate. David's company did. So we have different perspectives as well to share. I do think the predominant sort of perspective the CMS had was to start extremely aggressively and based on the outcomes then peel back. So I've talked to Abe and Jacob about these Access models, and I think what their thought was they wanted to challenge the industry to fundamentally rethink care delivery and not rely on the traditional models of one patient to one nurse or one patient to one doc interactions to say, how could we rethink with, especially with AI and tools, how much could you automate both the outreach, the enrollment, the coaching, and maybe the very last step of prescription still happens to be human, but could you automate your way out of those things? And I think that's where they started, which is why the codes are the way they are and the outcomes-based payments are so low. Because in a traditional model, if you just compare the two things, if you compare RPM codes, which are also CMS-driven, it's on average $105 to $125 per month. The entire outcomes-based payment for CKD for Access is, I think, $400 per year. So there's a substantial delta in those two numbers. And I think the reason is they really want to push the industry towards more AI-led approaches. It may not work. I have my doubts about it. It's not going to be effective. But if it's not, I think they'll come back towards the traditional model. But I think that's the rationale. But I'm curious, Dave.
I agree because, Ken already said it. The RPM codes and the payment mechanisms have been underutilized because they just weren't worth it for providers to have to spin up everything. There weren't a lot of successful RPM companies. A lot of people tried, a lot of companies died. So I think they're going to do a lot of experimentation. The ARPA-H program to build agentic specialty care. Well, what does that look like? Well, we don't know yet. And we don't know how successful it's going to be. But one thing we know, if we put oral GLP-1s in the water supply, we'd all be better off. Okay, I'm just telling you that right now. We'd be skinnier, we'd be happier, and we might actually live longer. But they're going to do a lot of experimentation. This administration seems open to that. I've heard Dr. Oz say it. I heard the late Dr. McCary. Oh, that's right, he's still alive, but no longer in his job. And so we're gonna have a lot of experiments, and we're gonna see what sticks. Not every experiment is a success, but you learn from your failures too.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay, so then my next question is, you're mentioning success. How should we be defining success in a couple of different ways? Are we defining success by the net spend per patient? Are we defining success by longevity? And if so, the health span, the meaningful active lifespan that we're providing patients? And also, even statistically, what is success? We are currently using models with marginal guarantees, estimates of uncertainty, which is your 95% confidence, which is on average over a population. And we are still using tools that are using population level statistics that are forcing clinicians to apply them to individual people in front of them. And so, generally speaking, for everyone, what is success?
I'm happy to start. I'm sure people have thoughts. I mean, I still go back to, if I think of a single equation that defines sort of success, to me, it's still value, and value is defined as quality over cost. So if you look at the standard sort of curve, that if you compare all the countries globally on your healthcare value, it would be like health span over cost spent per person, right? So I do think you can spend your way into better outcomes, but then it's not effective, it's not valuable. So I do think it's per capita spend for the amount of gain you get on quality of life and function. It's probably the best metric that accounts for both sides of the equation. But we have to, at the end of the day, I think in the US, find a way to bend the cost curve, even though it's challenging because every stakeholder wants to increase their market share. But at some point, we have to bend the cost curve. And I think we still, despite a decade of ACA and value-based care, we're not there yet.
Making more money, under the future, if somebody makes more money, somebody else is going to lose money. Because basically they're saying there's not going to be more money. And so I think that's the challenge, and someone who innovates and figures out how to address that challenge will be a winner. And people who don't figure out how to address that challenge will be the loser. And there will be losers in addition to winners. And how we value it, I mean, I think as physicians, we value it as a good outcome for my patient. As an institution, we value it as I do my mission and I'm in the black. So they're not always aligned. And I think we're going to have to figure out that conflict somehow as we move forward.
Yeah, talk about a loaded question, right? What is value? And everyone here has a different perception of value. And depending on which stakeholder you're speaking to, if I'm speaking to a patient, of course it's going to be a combination of cost, it's going to be a combination of quality of life. If I'm talking to a healthcare institution, I'm looking at the cost per patient, I'm looking at getting those patients in, as many as I can, rinse and repeat sort of scenario. If I'm talking to insurers, they're looking at the entire trajectory of those people that they insure and the cost borne by those patients. So whenever I'm working with companies, I want them to take into consideration that you're not going to be able to check all of the boxes. And if you try to do that, you're going to spend way more money, way more time, and way more energy than you anticipate. But what I want to see is at least a couple of those boxes checked off to become attractive. And yes, it all comes down to financial constraints. But at the end of the day, I also want to talk to the regulators and give them an applause because they're moving. It used to be they moved very slowly. They followed and followed as slowly as they could. They're actually keeping up with a lot of the innovation that's happening in the space. It's exciting to see the FDA, CMS, and a few other government organizations make announcements almost daily. It's almost hard to keep up with what's actually happening because they want to see this change implemented, given the constraints that this economy, given the constraints that healthcare exists in today.
So I'm going to change the question and throw it to Josh, since Josh was a stand-in moderator and would love for him to also have been a panelist. So really amazing innovators on the artificial intelligence front on stage here. If you think 5 years ahead, and Josh, maybe we'll start with you, or Dr. Lampert, and you think about the AI of ECGs and the capabilities of what you can detect from subtle changes in the ECG or patterns of changes over time with the ECG, where do you see us going in the next, with the rapid acceleration of AI and everything that you're working on and the group on stage is working on, where do you see this going, and what are you going to be able to detect from the ECG?
So I think the next 5 years is going to be very interesting in a couple of different ways. One, we have already demonstrated, not just our group, but many others, that using deep learning on an ECG can identify disease. It can identify disease earlier, before it's even phenotypically present. Patients who are identified and flagged as having a disease process, all of them have a higher cumulative incidence of actually developing that disease over time, suggesting that we're identifying more subphysiologic signals that we can't appreciate, that the echocardiogram isn't going to show. And there have been randomized controlled trials that have demonstrated value in terms of preventing 90-day mortality, even without quite understanding what the model was detecting, other than that the patient was flagged as having a higher 90-day mortality. And this was done in a randomized controlled trial. So I think that over time, we're going to see increased implementation of these models, but I think you're also going to start seeing a lot of mistakes. And I think the mistakes are going to come from the limitations in how the math is applied. And the thing that is very important for all of us to understand is that artificial intelligence is a great new tool. It will do a lot of things better than we can do now because, frankly, the way that medicine has been practiced for centuries has been, by design, flawed because of the computational ability and, frankly, the cognitive bandwidth of humans, right? So we're going to learn some lessons over the next 5 years in terms of unsuccessful deployments. The other thing that we will also learn is how we make clinical decisions and how we leverage these tools for clinical decision support, how we quantify uncertainty and weigh the risks and benefits of everything we're doing. And I think there might even start to become an appreciation to go back to basics and what it means to be a physician. When we graduate, we take an oath and we pledge to first do no harm. And I think a lot of this is going to be us going back to that, is relinquishing some of our egos to the better abilities of this math. That's all AI is. It's just math. It can be wrapped in different packages. It can be made to look very shiny. It's just math. And whoever applies it well and responsibly will do well, and so will the patients.
So do you see AI as like a trusted clinical advisor that you can go to and kind of verify if what you're thinking is accurate, or how do you see that evolution happening?
Trust means different things to different people. I mean, we're talking about what we need for guidelines. We're talking about what we need in trials. I mean, people are getting behind Teslas and letting this car drive them and relinquishing their life to this vehicle without a randomized trial showing that it was going to be okay. And then when we talk about detecting hypertension or anything else, all of a sudden we need a randomized trial, but it's okay, for this. So I think that there are different standards, and I think that as long as the governance structures are reasonable and that we make sure that we're implementing these tools safely, then that will be still better than what we're doing now. Remember, when everyone goes to see a doctor now, their expert judgment is trying to weigh benefits and risks that they cannot mathematically quantify, right? And they're doing their best to know what that means for you. Even guideline, recommendations for atrial fibrillation and stroke. The area under the receiver operating characteristic curve for the CHA2DS2-VASc score to predict who's going to have a stroke is 0.6. It's marginally better than a coin flip at discerning who's actually going to have that outcome, and we give anticoagulant blood thinners to all of those people, right? We're causing a lot of harm just from bleeding. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement, even though statistically we'll never be perfect.
Well, we've just seen that health system says they're going to get rid of their diagnostic radiologists and rely on AI. And Eric Topol says every mammogram should be read by 3 AIs. It's the notion of voting logic of 3 AIs. It's coming. Buckle up.
With that, we're at time. Thank you very much to the panel for a really great discussion, and to everyone who offered up questions. Those were excellent. Thank you very much. We'll all be around to continue the conversation offline.